Black woman took a job as Billionaire's fake wife. Months later, something shocking happened. She was broke, desperate, and running out of hope. When a powerful billionaire offered her a deal too big to refuse, pretend to be his wife for a few months. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale. But behind closed doors, it was built on a lie and a secret plan for revenge. Because the man she married owned the company that put her father in prison. She thought she knew the truth. She thought she knew the enemy. Then one night she finds hidden documents, and everything changes. The man she planned to destroy may be the only one who ever tried to save her father. So now she faces an impossible choice: expose him and finally get justice, or protect the man who never stopped protecting her. What would you do when revenge collides with love? And the truth could destroy everything. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The darkness before dawn settled heavily in Talia Moore's tiny apartment as she stood frozen, staring at the bright orange paper taped carelessly to her door. The final eviction notice glared back at her, its bold black letters seeming to mock her struggles. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the paper, its rough texture a reminder of how real this nightmare was. 3 days, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn quiet. Just 3 days left. The apartment, though small, held what remained of her life. A twin bed pushed against one wall, a rickety table that served as both dining spot and desk, and a few cardboard boxes containing her father's belongings. She hadn't been able to bring herself to unpack them since the funeral 6 months ago. Talia moved through her morning routine mechanically, the fluorescent bathroom light casting harsh shadows under her eyes as she prepared for another day at Jerry's diner. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked far older than her 26 years, worn down by grief and struggle. Her dark hair was pulled back severely into a practical bun, her waitress uniform already showing signs of wear despite careful washing. As she applied a light coat of mascara, her one concession to vanity, memories of her father's funeral crashed over her like waves. The rain that day had been relentless, matching her mood as reporters lurked at the edges of the cemetery, their cameras clicking away like hungry insects. The headlines had been merciless. Convicted embezzler dies in prison. Disgraced executive leaves legacy of shame. He was innocent, Talia said firmly to her reflection, a daily ritual that helped her face each morning. And I'll prove it someday. The walk to Jerry's diner took exactly 17 minutes, each step bringing her closer to another day of forced smiles and careful penny counting. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn, but Talia barely noticed. Her mind was too full of calculations: rent, utilities, groceries, and the mounting legal fees from her failed attempts to reopen her father's case. The diner's neon sign buzzed weakly as she approached, the R flickering in and out like a dying firefly. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon grease wrapped around her like an old, familiar blanket. Not particularly pleasant, but consistent and known. "You're early again, Talia," Margaret, the morning cook, called out from behind the griddle. Her weathered face creased into a warm smile, one of the few genuine interactions Talia could count on these days. "Traffic was light," Talia replied with a slight smile, though they both knew she walked to work. The morning rush came and went, a blur of coffee refills and toast orders. Most customers looked right through her, as if she were just another piece of the diner's worn furniture. Talia had perfected the art of invisible service, efficient, quiet, forgettable. It was safer that way, less chance of someone recognizing her name or making the connection to the scandal that had destroyed her family. But the afternoon brought change in the form of a man in an expensive suit, his presence jarringly out of place among the diner's regular crowd. From the moment he sat down, his attitude grated on her nerves. The way he snapped his fingers for service, his dismissive glance at her name tag, the curl of his lip as he surveyed the menu. "I suppose this place is clean enough to eat in," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the nearly empty diner. "Though I have my doubts about some of the help." Talia felt her face grow hot, but kept her expression neutral as she took his order. Years of practice had taught her to swallow such casual cruelty with a smile. The breaking point came when he began harassing Maria, the teenage busser who had recently started working weekends. His comments grew increasingly racist, each one more vicious than the last. "I don't feel comfortable with her handling my plates," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Who knows where those hands have been?" Something snapped inside Talia. The weight of the morning's eviction notice, the memories of her father's shame, and now this man's casual cruelty. It was too much. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man's face reddened. "Excuse me." "This establishment has the right to refuse service to anyone," Talia continued, drawing on her abbreviated law school education, "and we refuse to serve customers who harass our staff." What followed was a blur of shouting, threats, and finally Jerry himself emerging from his office, his face purple with anger, not at the customer, but at her. "You're fired," he spat, not even looking at her as he apologized profusely to the man in the suit. "Clear out your locker and don't come back." The walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of her situation. By the time Talia reached her apartment, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors she was too numb to appreciate. She sat on her bed, the springs creaking beneath her, and finally let the tears come. They fell silently at first, then in great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "God," she prayed, her voice breaking, "I know you're there. I know you hear me, but I don't understand. What am I supposed to do? How can I keep fighting when everything keeps falling apart?" The silence that followed was interrupted only by the hum of her ancient laptop, still open on her small table. As if drawn by an unseen hand, her eyes moved to the screen, where a new email had just appeared in her inbox. The subject line read simply, "Confidential domestic contract. Immediate response required." Her first instinct was to delete it, just another scam targeting desperate people. Her cursor hovered over the delete button, but something made her hesitate. The promised salary figure caught her eye, more money than she'd make in 5 years at the diner. Talia's finger remained poised over the mouse button as she stared at the screen, torn between hope and suspicion, between desperation and caution. The orange eviction notice seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder of her dwindling options. She pulled her hand back from the mouse, leaving the email unopened but not deleted, its presence like a question mark at the end of this terrible day. The morning sun cast long shadows between the downtown skyscrapers as Talia stepped off the bus, clutching the printed email instructions in her trembling hands. Her sensible black dress, the one she'd worn to job interviews and her father's funeral, felt inadequate among the professionally dressed people streaming into the gleaming office buildings. The address led her to the Morrison Building, 52 stories of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the sky. In the polished marble lobby, her reflection looked small and uncertain. The security guard examined her ID carefully before directing her to the 38th floor. "Caldwell, Martinez and Associates," Talia read from the brass plaque outside the law office. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The receptionist, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 50s, looked up with a practiced smile. "May I help you?" "I'm Talia Moore. I have an appointment regarding a confidential contract." Something flickered in the receptionist's eyes. Recognition, perhaps? She picked up her phone, murmured a few words, and moments later directed Talia to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. A man in an impeccable charcoal suit was waiting for her. "Ms. Moore, I'm James Martinez. Thank you for coming." He gestured to one of the leather chairs. "Please, have a seat." Talia sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap just as her father had taught her for important meetings. The email was rather vague about the nature of this contract. Intentionally so. Martinez placed a thick folder on the table between them. "Before we proceed, I need you to sign this non-disclosure agreement." Talia's law school training kicked in as she read through the document carefully. The terms were standard but strict. Any breach would result in substantial penalties. She signed with the offered pen, her signature neat and controlled despite her racing heart. "Excellent." Martinez opened the folder. "Ms. Moore, what I'm about to propose may seem unusual, but I assure you it's both legal and potentially very beneficial for all parties involved." He paused, studying her face. "Are you familiar with Graham Whitlock?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Of course, she knew Graham Whitlock, CEO of Whitlock Industries, the company whose testimony had helped send her father to prison. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "I've heard of him. Mr. Whitlock is currently orchestrating a sensitive merger worth billions of dollars. However, recent, personal developments have made some investors nervous. We need to project stability." Martinez leaned forward slightly. "We need you to marry him." The words hung in the air between them. Talia's mind raced, connecting dots she'd never imagined would align. "I don't understand." "It would be a temporary arrangement, 6 months, with the possibility of extension if necessary. You would live in Mr. Whitlock's residence but maintain separate bedrooms. All interactions would be strictly professional. Your privacy would be guaranteed, and you would be generously compensated." He named a figure that made Talia's breath catch. As Martinez continued outlining the terms, public appearances, social media guidelines, confidentiality clauses, Talia's initial shock gave way to something else. Was this divine intervention? A chance to get close to the man whose company had destroyed her father's life? "Why me?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice remained. "You were carefully selected based on several criteria. Your background check shows you're intelligent, discreet, and have no current romantic entanglements. Your father's situation actually works in our favor. It makes you more invested in privacy." Talia's hands clenched beneath the table at the casual reference to her father's imprisonment. "And Mr. Whitlock? Does he know about my father?" "Mr. Whitlock knows everything relevant to this arrangement. He's approved your selection." Martinez pushed another document across the table. "This is the full contract. Take your time reviewing it." The afternoon stretched on as Talia read every word, asked pointed questions, and negotiated small adjustments. By 4 o'clock, she had signed her name to the contract, her heart pounding with equal parts anxiety and determination. "Congratulations, Ms. Moore," Martinez said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the family, so to speak. Someone will contact you tomorrow with further details." The sun was setting by the time Talia returned to her apartment. She sat down at her laptop, hands hovering over the keyboard before typing "Graham Whitlock" into the search engine. His photo appeared immediately. A man in his early 40s with steel-grey eyes and an expression of careful control. He looked exactly like someone who would sacrifice an innocent man for corporate profits. Talia touched her father's photo on her desk, her fingers tracing his familiar smile. "I'm going to find out the truth, Dad," she whispered. "I promise." She studied Graham's photo again, memorizing every detail of the face that would soon become part of her daily life. 6 months of playing the dutiful wife while searching for evidence of her father's wrongful conviction. 6 months to find justice. Talia closed her laptop, her resolve hardening into something sharp and focused. Tomorrow would begin her new life as Mrs. Graham Whitlock. She just prayed she was strong enough to see it through. The sleek black car wound its way up the tree-lined driveway of Whitlock Manor, each turn revealing more of the massive stone estate. Talia sat in the back seat, a single battered suitcase beside her, trying to steady her breathing. The morning sun caught the mansion's many windows, making them gleam like watchful eyes. "We've arrived, Ms. Moore," the driver announced, coming to a stop at the front entrance. Talia gripped the handle of her suitcase tighter. "Thank you." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. The enormity of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. The grand double doors opened and a tall figure emerged. Graham Whitlock, in person, was somehow both exactly like and nothing like his photographs. His expensive suit fit perfectly, his posture was impeccable, but there was something almost fragile about the way he held himself, like a man carrying an invisible burden. "Ms. Moore," he greeted her, his voice deep and controlled. "Welcome to Whitlock Manor." Talia forced herself to meet his eyes, searching for any sign of the callousness that must have allowed him to destroy her father's life. But his grey eyes were merely distant, professional. "Mr. Whitlock, thank you for having me." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Graham gestured toward the door. "Please come inside. Mrs. Harrison will show you to your room." A woman in her 60s appeared, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "This way, dear," she said warmly, reaching for Talia's suitcase. "I can carry it," Talia said quickly, not wanting to part with her few possessions in this strange place. The interior of Whitlock Manor was just as impressive as the exterior. Soaring ceilings, gleaming hardwood floors, artwork that probably cost more than Talia had made in her entire life. Mrs. Harrison led her up a grand staircase, chattering about meal times and household schedules, but Talia was only half listening. Her mind was cataloguing every detail, every potential place where important documents might be kept. "This will be your room," Mrs. Harrison announced, opening a door on the second floor. "Mr. Whitlock's suite is at the other end of the hall." The guest bedroom was larger than Talia's entire apartment, with a sitting area and a private bathroom. Pale blue walls, crisp white bedding, fresh flowers on the dresser. It was beautiful and impersonal, like a high-end hotel room. "The ceremony is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Mrs. Harrison continued. "I've laid out some suitable options in the closet. Will you need help getting ready?" Talia shook her head. "No, thank you. I can manage." Left alone, she opened the closet to find several expensive dresses, all in her size. The sight made her stomach clench. How long had they been watching her, planning this? She selected a simple navy blue dress, appropriate for both a wedding and a business transaction. The civil ceremony took place in Whitlock Manor's library, with wood-panelled walls and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves as their witnesses. Besides Graham and Talia, only Martinez and 2 other lawyers were present. No family, no friends, no celebration, just the quiet scratch of pens on legal documents. "With the power vested in me," the justice of the peace intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss, just a formal handshake. Talia's new wedding ring felt heavy and foreign on her finger. Dinner that evening was served in a formal dining room long enough to seat 20, though only 2 places were set. The table's polished surface reflected the chandelier's light like scattered diamonds. Talia sat stiffly in her chair, hyper-aware of every movement she made. The salmon is excellent, Graham commented after several minutes of silence. Chef Morris is one of the best in the city. Yes, it's very good, Talia replied, though she could barely taste the food. Graham set down his fork carefully. I want to thank you for your professionalism throughout this process. I know this isn't a conventional situation. Talia studied him as he spoke. The careful way he chose his words, how he maintained perfect posture even while seemingly trying to relax. Was this the same man who had testified against her father? How could someone destroy an innocent person's life and then sit here discussing salmon? I understand what's required, she said. We both have our reasons for agreeing to this arrangement. Something flickered across Graham's face, surprise, concern, but it was gone too quickly to interpret. Yes, we do. He returned to his meal, and silence fell again. After dinner, Talia retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She changed out of the expensive dress into her own worn pajamas, feeling more like herself. From her suitcase, she pulled out a fresh notebook, its cover still crisp and new. With careful letters, she wrote, "Truth" on the front. Sitting cross-legged on the enormous bed, Talia opened the notebook to its first blank page. At the top, she wrote the date, then began listing her observations from the day, the layout of the house, the names of staff members, Graham's schedule and habits. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The chandelier's light caught her wedding ring as she wrote, making it sparkle. Talia paused, looking at this symbol of their false marriage. 6 months, she reminded herself. 6 months to find evidence that would clear her father's name. 6 months to uncover whatever Graham Whitlock was hiding behind his perfect manners and controlled expressions. She returned to her notes, writing until her hand cramped and her eyes grew heavy. Tomorrow would begin her first full day as Mrs. Whitlock, and she couldn't afford to miss anything. Every detail might be important, every conversation might hold a clue. Her father had always taught her that the truth would come out if you watched and listened carefully enough. Talia closed the notebook and slid it into her bedside drawer. The bed was impossibly soft, the sheets smoother than any she'd ever slept in, but comfort felt dangerous here. She needed to stay sharp, stay focused. This wasn't her home. It was her mission field. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as Talia entered the Manor's breakfast room the next morning. The table was already set with fine china and silver utensils that probably cost more than her old apartment's monthly rent. Graham sat at one end, reading something on his tablet while sipping coffee from a delicate cup. "Good morning," he said, looking up briefly. "I hope you slept well. Please, help yourself." A uniformed staff member appeared silently at her elbow with a carafe of coffee. "Thank you," Talia murmured, still adjusting to being waited on. The spread before her included fresh fruit, pastries, and what looked like made-to-order omelettes keeping warm under silver covers. "We should discuss your schedule," Graham said as she settled in with her plate. "Martinez has arranged several public appearances for us over the next few weeks. There's a charity luncheon tomorrow and the hospital board dinner next week." Talia nodded, spreading a linen napkin across her lap. "What exactly will be expected of me?" "Mainly to be present and pleasant. Some light conversation with donors and board members. Nothing too taxing." He paused, setting down his tablet. "I know this is all new to you. Mrs. Harrison will help you prepare for each event. She has extensive experience managing social obligations." "How considerate," Talia said, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. She carefully cut into her omelette. "I wouldn't want to embarrass the company with my inexperience." Graham's expression remained neutral. "That's not what I meant. I simply want you to feel supported, not overwhelmed. The media attention can be intense." Taking advantage of the opening, Talia pressed further. Speaking of the company, I read about your recent ethical guidelines overhaul. Quite progressive. What prompted that? Standard industry evolution. Graham replied smoothly. We're always looking to improve our practices. He returned to his tablet, clearly closing that line of conversation. Talia hid her frustration behind her coffee cup. She would need to be more subtle in her questioning. After breakfast, Mrs. Harrison appeared with a thick binder. Your orientation materials, Mrs. Whitlock. Shall we begin? The next several hours were filled with protocol lessons, proper forms of address for various dignitaries, seating arrangements at formal events, acceptable topics of conversation with the press. Talia's head spun with details, but she absorbed everything carefully. Each piece of information was potentially useful. The staff directory is in Section 3, Mrs. Harrison explained. You'll want to familiarize yourself with everyone's roles and schedules. Talia flipped through the pages, memorizing names and faces. Does everyone live on site? Only essential household staff. Others commute daily. Mrs. Harrison's tone was professional but warm. Mr. Whitlock insists on excellent benefits and fair treatment for all employees. It's why we have such low turnover. That didn't fit with Talia's image of Graham as a ruthless corporate shark. She filed the information away for later consideration. When Mrs. Harrison left for lunch, Talia took the opportunity to explore. She walked the manor's halls slowly, as if simply admiring the artwork, while mentally mapping the layout. Several doors were locked. Graham's private office, a secure file room, what appeared to be a personal study. She noted their locations in her phone under the guise of photographing interesting architectural details. The afternoon sun slanted through western windows as Talia made her way to the ground floor. Voices drifted from around a corner. Graham on the phone, his tone sharper than she'd heard before. That's completely unacceptable, Davidson, he was saying. Miguel has worked here for 15 years. He deserves your respect, regardless of his position. Talia pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. I don't care if he's just a janitor. He's a valued member of this household, and I won't have you or anyone else treating him with condescension. Are we clear? A pause, then Graham's voice turned cold. Perhaps you should reconsider your attitude before our next board meeting. Good day. Talia heard him end the call with a frustrated sigh. She waited until his footsteps faded before continuing her walk, mind churning. Graham's defense of the janitor seemed genuine. There had been real anger in his voice at the executive's disrespect. It didn't match what she knew about the man who had testified against her father, destroying their family's reputation and security. But she couldn't afford to let this one incident shake her resolve. Maybe Graham was skilled at maintaining a benevolent public image. Maybe he only protected his own employees while disregarding others. Or maybe there was more to the story than she understood, which was exactly why she needed to keep digging. Back in her room that evening, Talia added detailed notes to her journal about the day's observations, the locked rooms, the staff dynamics, Graham's phone conversation. Everything might be significant. But the most unsettling entry was her own confused reaction to seeing a different side of Graham Whitlock. Focus, she whispered to herself. Remember why you're here. She touched the small photo of her father she kept in her wallet, his smile untouched by the troubles that would later destroy him. The truth was, here somewhere in this house, behind these locked doors, and she would find it. As darkness fell outside her windows, Talia reviewed her plans for the coming days. The charity luncheon tomorrow would be her first public appearance as Mrs. Whitlock. She needed to play her role perfectly, while staying alert for any useful information. Graham's walls might be high, but everyone had weak spots. She just had to keep watching, keep listening, keep pretending until she found them. The elegant room around her still felt like a stage set, temporary and artificial. But for the next 6 months, this was her theatre, and she had the starring role. Tomorrow, the real performance would begin. The days at Whitlock Manor fell into a steady rhythm as April melted into May. Each morning, Talia would join Graham for a carefully orchestrated breakfast, their movements like actors hitting their marks. He would scan financial reports while she reviewed their social calendar, their parallel routines never quite intersecting. "The Children's Hospital benefit is tonight," she reminded him one morning, spreading jam on her toast. "They're expecting both of us to speak." Graham nodded without looking up. "Harrison left talking points in your study. We should arrive separately. It looks more natural that way." Their public appearances had become a well-rehearsed dance. Talia would enter first, working the room with practiced charm. Graham would arrive 15 minutes later, and they'd share a tender greeting that photographers eagerly captured. His hand would rest lightly on her back, her smile would reach her eyes, and no one seemed to notice how they never quite relaxed in each other's presence. The charity circuit kept them busy. Hospital fundraisers, education initiatives, environmental galas. Talia found herself actually enjoying some of the work, especially when it involved direct interaction with the causes they supported. At a literacy program launch, she spent an hour reading to wide-eyed kindergarteners while Graham discussed funding with the school board. The children's genuine excitement touched something in her that had been dormant since her father's death. Late-night strategy meetings became routine, Graham's office illuminated until well past midnight as they prepared for important presentations. He was meticulous in his preparation, insisting they review every detail. "The merger announcement is in 3 weeks," he explained one evening, loosening his tie as he paced. "The media will scrutinize everything. Our body language, our story, our commitment. We can't afford any inconsistencies." Talia watched him from her perch on the leather sofa, noting the tension in his shoulders. "You're worried about more than just the media coverage, aren't you?" He paused by the window, staring out at the darkened gardens. "This merger could secure thousands of jobs. I won't let anything jeopardize that." There was something in his voice, a weight of responsibility that seemed to go beyond corporate success. Talia added it to her mental file of observations about the man she was supposed to hate. Her legal training proved invaluable as she began carefully exploring the mansion's resources. Graham had given her access to shared network drives for their public relations work, and she discovered they contained archives stretching back years. During quiet afternoons, she would methodically search through folders, tracking business decisions and internal communications. "You have quite a knack for organization," Graham commented one day, finding her surrounded by carefully sorted documents. "The legal department could use someone with your attention to detail." Talia forced a light laugh, just trying to be helpful. But her heart raced at how close he'd come to guessing her background. As May turned to June, Graham asked her to help organize his home office files. "The merger's generating too much paperwork," he explained. "I need everything properly catalogued and archived." It was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Each evening, after the household staff had retired, Talia would spend hours in Graham's office. She started with recent files, establishing a logical system that earned his trust. Gradually, she worked her way back through older records. The sealed drawer was hidden behind a false panel. She might never have found it if she hadn't dropped a paperclip behind the filing cabinet. The old correspondence inside made her breath catch. Letters, court documents, newspaper clippings, all related to her father's case. With trembling hands, Talia began to read. There were internal memos she'd never seen before, correspondence between Graham and the board of directors, private investigators' reports. But most devastating were the letters from Reverend Moore himself. her father's own words painting a picture completely different from what she'd believed. The truth spilled out across the antique carpet as midnight crept toward dawn. Her father had discovered the corruption, yes, but it hadn't been Graham behind it. The evidence showed a complex web of fraud orchestrated by other executives, with Graham working secretly to expose it. Her father's letters revealed his trust in Graham, their shared determination to bring the truth to light. But something had gone wrong. The corrupt board members had moved first, twisting evidence to implicate her father instead. Graham's frantic attempts to prevent it were documented in a series of increasingly desperate messages. The final letter was from her father, written just before his arrest. "Mr. Whitlock, they're moving faster than we anticipated. Destroy the evidence I sent you. If they find it, more families will suffer. I can weather this storm knowing the truth is safe with you. Keep fighting the good fight. Thomas More." Talia sat surrounded by the scattered papers, her world tilting on its axis. Everything she'd believed about Graham Whitlock, every assumption that had driven her quest for revenge, crumbled in the face of documented truth. Her father hadn't been Graham's victim. He'd been his ally. And Graham's testimony at the trial. Had he been protecting her father's wishes by hiding the evidence that might have cleared him? The first light of dawn was creeping through the windows as Talia stared at her father's signature. She had come here seeking justice, only to discover she'd been fighting the wrong battle all along. The weight of truth pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In the growing light, the scattered papers around her held not ammunition for revenge, but pieces of a puzzle she had completely misunderstood. Morning light filtered through the dining room windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where Talia sat, her untouched coffee growing cold. She hadn't slept, her mind racing with the revelations from those documents. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her cup. Graham entered precisely at 7 o'clock, as he did every morning. His suit was perfectly pressed, his manner composed as always. But today, Talia saw him differently, not as the villain she'd imagined, but as someone carrying burdens she hadn't understood. "You're up early," he commented, accepting a fresh cup of coffee from Maria, their housekeeper. Talia watched him carefully, gathering her courage. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "I was thinking about my father." Graham's hand stilled momentarily as he reached for the sugar bowl. It was barely noticeable, but Talia caught it, the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he set down his spoon. "Thomas More," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know him well?" The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Graham's face remained carefully neutral, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, measured. "Your father was a good man." Those 5 words held volumes of unspoken meaning. He didn't ask how she knew, didn't deny the connection. Instead, he stood slowly, straightening his tie with deliberate movements. "I have meetings all day. Don't wait up." Talia watched him leave, noting how his usual confident stride seemed heavier, burdened. The soft click of the front door echoing through the house felt like punctuation to an unfinished conversation. Once alone, she returned to Graham's office. The morning sun illuminated dust motes dancing in the air as she carefully retrieved the hidden documents. With growing understanding, she read through detailed reports of Graham's attempts to expose the corruption within his own company. Board meeting minutes showed his careful questioning, his strategic moves to gather evidence without alerting the guilty parties. One particular document made her breath catch, a transcript of her father's testimony before the Ethics Committee. His words jumped off the page. Mr. Whitlock acted with integrity throughout this investigation. He put himself at considerable risk to protect both the company's employees and its ethical standards. Tears blurred her vision as she read her father's careful defense of Graham, understanding now that both men had been fighting the same battle. Graham hadn't been the enemy. He'd been her father's ally, trying to stop the very corruption that would eventually destroy both their lives. The afternoon slipped away as Talia pieced together the full story. She found evidence of Graham's behind-the-scenes efforts to protect employees' pensions when the scandal broke, using his personal funds to cover losses. There were records of anonymous donations to families affected by the corruption, all traced back to Graham's private accounts. As evening settled over the mansion, Talia found herself in the living room. The weight of truth and regret drove her to her knees beside the elegant sofa. "Father God," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I was so wrong. I let bitterness blind me. Please forgive me." She didn't hear Graham return, didn't notice him standing in the doorway until his shadow fell across the carpet. Looking up, she met his gaze, and in that moment everything changed. The careful distance they'd maintained crumbled in the face of shared understanding. His eyes held a mix of pain, recognition, and something deeper, a reflection of her own struggle with truth and forgiveness. The mask of professional detachment slipped, revealing the weight of years spent carrying secrets that had protected her father's final wishes. They stayed there, frozen in that moment of wordless recognition. Talia on her knees in prayer, Graham standing in the doorway, the truth of their shared history finally acknowledged between them. The setting sun painted the room in soft golden light, illuminating tears on Talia's cheeks and the gentle compassion in Graham's eyes. In that silent exchange, walls built on misunderstanding began to crumble. The carefully maintained fiction of their arranged marriage shifted, making space for something real and unexpected, a connection born of shared pain and newfound understanding. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly, marking the moment. Neither spoke, but they didn't need to. The truth they both now knew hung in the air between them, changing everything yet fixing nothing, leaving them balanced on the edge of something neither had anticipated when they'd signed their careful contract. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Graham's study, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Talia stood in the doorway, watching as Graham sorted through papers on his desk. The space felt different now, less intimidating, more weighted with shared history. "Please come in," Graham said softly, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. His usual crisp appearance seemed slightly rumpled, as if he too had spent a sleepless night wrestling with memories. Talia settled into the chair, noting how Graham's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a worn leather folder from his bottom drawer. "I've kept these all these years," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your father, Reverend Moore, he was the bravest man I've ever known." He opened the folder, revealing photographs and letters that made Talia's heart clench. Her father's familiar handwriting jumped out from the pages, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. "When we uncovered the corruption," Graham continued, "it went deeper than anyone imagined. Hundreds of employees' pensions were at risk. Your father—" He paused, collecting himself. "Your father was the first to understand the full scope of it." Talia leaned forward, hanging on to every word. "But why didn't he speak up? Why take the blame?" Graham's eyes filled with pain. "Because he saw what would happen if the truth came out all at once. The company would have collapsed immediately. 3,000 families would have lost everything, not just pensions, but jobs, healthcare, homes." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture making him look younger, more vulnerable. "Your father refused to let that happen. So he chose silence," Talia whispered, understanding dawning like a painful sunrise. He said God had shown him the way. Graham pulled out a letter, handling it with reverence. He wrote this the night before he testified, said that sometimes the greatest act of love is to bear others' burdens, even when it costs everything. Talia took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing her father's distinctive signature at the bottom. The words blurred through her tears as she read his explanation, his choice to protect the innocent by accepting blame, his trust that God would eventually bring truth to light. "I tried to stop him," Graham said, his voice cracking. "Offered to take the fall myself, but he wouldn't hear of it. Said I needed to stay in position to help the families, to make things right slowly, carefully." The weight of years of misplaced anger crashed over Talia. She doubled over in her chair, sobs racking her body. All the bitter words she'd spoken about Graham, all the plans for revenge, they crumbled in the face of this truth. Her father hadn't been a victim of corporate greed. He'd been a willing sacrifice for others' salvation. Graham moved around the desk, kneeling beside her chair. He didn't touch her, but his presence offered silent support as she grieved. "Your father never lost his faith," he said quietly. "Even in prison, he counseled other inmates, led Bible studies. He transformed lives right up until he died," Talia finished, wiping her eyes. "I was so angry at his funeral, so sure he'd been wronged. I couldn't understand why he seemed at peace." "Because he knew the truth," Graham said gently, "and he trusted God's timing." They sat in silence as the morning light grew stronger. Talia's tears gradually slowed as years of bitterness drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache and new questions. "What do I do now?" she asked, more to herself than Graham. "How do I honor his sacrifice?" Graham stood slowly, gathering the documents with careful hands. "Your father used to say that truth takes time, that God's justice works differently than man's justice." He paused, looking out the window. "Maybe that's why you're here now. Maybe it's time for some of the truth to come to light." The rest of the day passed in a blur of memories and revelations. Talia retreated to her room, needing space to process everything she'd learned. As night fell, exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. In her dreams, she stood in her father's old church. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. Her father stood at the pulpit, just as she remembered him. Tall and strong, his face gentle with wisdom. "Truth takes time, baby girl," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered. "Sometimes love means waiting for God's perfect timing." She woke just before dawn, tears drying on her cheeks. The first pale light of morning crept through her window as she lay there, facing a new burden. The truth she now held was both gift and responsibility. What to do with it? How to honor both her father's sacrifice and God's timing? The weight of these questions settled over her as she watched the sun rise, painting the sky in shades of hope and uncertainty. The truth had finally come to light, but what that light would reveal remained to be seen. The days following Graham's revelation unfolded like pages turning in a well-worn Bible, each one revealing new understanding. Talia found herself watching him differently during their shared meals, seeing past the careful facade to glimpses of the man beneath. At breakfast 3 days later, she noticed how he absently stirred his coffee long after the cream had blended in, lost in thought. "The merger paperwork comes through next week," he said, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. "The board meeting will be challenging." Talia surprised herself by reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. The moment their eyes met, something shifted, like a door opening just a crack, letting in fresh air. That evening, while they reviewed social calendars in the study, Graham's mother Evelyn arrived unannounced. She swept into the room with the quiet authority of someone used to making herself at home, her silver hair elegant against her dark blazer. "So this is the young lady," Evelyn said, her warm brown eyes studying Talia with unexpected gentleness. Without waiting for introductions, she sat down beside her on the leather sofa. "Graham told me about your father." Talia tensed, but Evelyn simply took her hand. "My dear, I recognize that look in your eyes. I wore it myself once when my marriage fell apart and my faith was all I had left." "Mother," Graham warned, but Evelyn waved him off. "Hush now. Sometimes we need to speak truth to heal." She turned back to Talia. "The Lord gives us burdens to carry, but He never meant for us to carry them alone." Something in Evelyn's words broke through Talia's carefully maintained composure. Tears welled up as weeks of emotional upheaval caught up with her. To her surprise, Graham crossed the room and handed her his handkerchief, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. Over the next few days, Evelyn became a regular presence at the manor. She arrived most afternoons, often bringing homemade cookies or fresh flowers. While Graham attended to business calls, she and Talia would sit in the garden, talking about everything and nothing. "My son carries guilt like some men carry briefcases," Evelyn confided one afternoon, deadheading roses with practiced care. "Always ready, always heavy. But I see how he looks at you when you're not watching. You make him lighter somehow." Talia blushed, remembering how Graham had smiled at her over dinner the night before. A real smile, not the practiced one he wore for photographers. "He's different than I expected," she admitted. "Life rarely gives us what we expect," Evelyn said wisely. "Sometimes it gives us what we need instead." The evening conversations between Talia and Graham grew longer, more personal. She learned he played piano but hadn't touched the keys since his father died. He discovered she could quote entire passages of scripture from memory, a gift from years of Sunday school. One night, after a particularly trying board meeting, Graham loosened his tie and spoke about his fears. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to make things right," he confessed. "Your father believed in me, but what if I'm not worthy of that trust?" Talia found herself moving to sit beside him on the window seat. "My father was an excellent judge of character," she said softly. "I'm beginning to understand why he chose to believe in you." The fundraiser came at the end of the week, a glamorous affair benefiting inner-city youth programs. Talia wore a midnight blue gown that made her feel both elegant and exposed. Throughout the evening, she felt Graham's eyes following her as she moved through the crowd, playing her role as his wife with growing ease. Later, as they slow danced for the benefit of watching donors, he held her closer than strictly necessary. "I never expected this," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "Expected what?" "To trust someone again. To trust you." His words carried the weight of confession. "After everything that happened with your father, I closed myself off. But you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The music swelled around them, and Talia let herself lean into his embrace. Her heart beat an uncomfortable rhythm of recognition as she realized the truth. She was falling in love with Graham Whitlock. The man she had meant to destroy had instead rebuilt something broken inside her, brick by careful brick. Later that night, alone in her room, Talia stood at the window, watching moonlight silver the garden below. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse. Love had crept in when she wasn't looking, taking root in the soil of shared meals and evening conversations, nurtured by understanding and unexpected grace. The irony wasn't lost on her, that in seeking justice for her father, she had found something her father had known all along. the transformative power of truth spoken in love. Graham Whitlock wasn't the villain of her story anymore. He was becoming its heart. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Talia stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Graham's home office. Outside, leaves danced across the manicured lawn in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with possibility as Graham finished his phone call with the merger team. "The final paperwork will be ready next week," he said, setting down his phone with unusual gentleness. His voice held an undertone she couldn't quite read. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." Talia nodded, her throat tight. Their contract marriage had served its purpose, stabilizing investor confidence, presenting a united front to the board. Soon it would all be over. The thought left an unexpected ache in her chest. "Talia." Graham's chair creaked as he stood. "Would you walk with me? The garden is lovely at this time of day." She followed him outside, where the setting sun painted the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and orange. The air smelled of late roses and approaching evening. Their footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as they made their way past carefully tended flower beds. "These past months," Graham began, then paused. His usual composure seemed to falter. "They haven't been what I expected." "No," Talia agreed softly. "They haven't." They reached the stone bench near the fountain, their unofficial spot for evening conversations. Graham didn't sit, though. Instead, he paced a few steps, his hands clasped behind his back. "The merger will be complete in 2 weeks," he said. "Our contract will end." Talia's heart squeezed painfully. "Yes, I know. I've been thinking." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. "About what comes after." The fountain burbled quietly in the background as Graham searched for words. Talia had never seen him so uncertain, this man who commanded boardrooms with ease. "Would you consider staying?" The words came out in a rush. "Not because of a contract, not because of business, but because—" He drew a deep breath. "Because I love you." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Talia stared at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope he couldn't quite hide. "I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know our beginning was unconventional, but somewhere between the charity events and late-night conversations, between learning your father's truth and watching you with my mother, I fell in love with you, Talia Moore." Tears pricked at her eyes. The truth of her original plan sat heavy on her tongue. How she'd come seeking vengeance, how she'd planned to expose him. But looking at him now, seeing the man she'd come to know instead of the villain she'd imagined, the words wouldn't come. "Graham, She swallowed hard. This man had shown her nothing but honesty, had honored her father's memory, had treated her with unfailing respect. He deserved the truth. But would the truth destroy this fragile, beautiful thing growing between them? He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fading sunlight reflected in his eyes. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. I know this is sudden. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I needed you to know." Talia looked down at their joined hands. His strong and steady, hers trembling slightly. "I've never met anyone like you," she whispered. "You've changed everything I thought I knew." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Is that a good thing?" She squeezed his hand, letting actions speak where words failed. Together they watched the sun sink lower, painting the garden in deepening shadows. The moment felt both perfect and precarious, full of promise and weighted with unspoken truths. Graham's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "We could take it slow," he offered. "Figure things out together." Talia leaned slightly against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Tomorrow she would find the courage to tell him everything. Tomorrow she would trust that the love growing between them was strong enough to weather the truth. But for now, she simply held his hand as the garden settled into evening around them, hoping that love really could conquer all things, even the shadows of the past. The fountain continued its gentle song as darkness crept in, and fireflies began to dance among the roses. Neither of them moved to go inside, content to share this moment of possibility, of hope, of love tentatively offered and carefully held. "Thank you," Graham murmured. "For what?" "For making me believe in second chances." His words hung in the fragrant air between them, full of promise and possibility. Talia squeezed his hand again, her heart full of love and heavy with secrets, unaware that their careful peace was about to be shattered. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Whitlock Industries' main lobby, catching the brass lettering that spelled out the company name. It was just another Tuesday, until it wasn't. Talia was reviewing charitable donation paperwork in Graham's office when the first signs of trouble appeared. Raised voices echoed from the hallway, followed by the sharp click of multiple footsteps approaching. The door burst open, revealing 3 men in dark suits, flanked by building security. "Mr. Whitlock," the lead agent announced, flashing his credentials. "I'm Special Agent Thompson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to search these premises." Graham rose from his desk, his face a mask of calm professionalism. "May I see the warrant, please?" As he reviewed the document, more agents filed in, carrying boxes and electronic equipment. The quiet efficiency of their movements sent chills down Talia's spine. "Sir," one of the younger agents called out, "the media is gathering outside." Graham's phone began buzzing incessantly. His assistant appeared in the doorway, looking panicked. "Mr. Whitlock, every news outlet in the city is calling. They're saying they have documents." "What documents?" Graham's voice remained steady, but Talia saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of his desk. The answer came from the flat-screen television mounted on the wall. A news anchor's grave face filled the screen as bold text scrolled beneath. "Breaking news. Whistleblower exposes corruption at Whitlock Industries." The room fell silent as the reporter's words filled the air. Anonymous sources have provided extensive documentation suggesting systematic fraud and corruption within Whitlock Industries dating back 5 years. These documents, allegedly from CEO Graham Whitlock's private files. Graham's head snapped up, his eyes finding Talia's across the room. In that moment, she saw the exact second doubt crept in, followed by understanding, then devastation. "Everyone out," he said quietly, "except Mrs. Whitlock." The agents exchanged glances but continued their work. "Sir, you can continue your search in 5 minutes." Graham's tone left no room for argument. 5 minutes. Once the door clicked shut, silence stretched between them like a chasm. Talia's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. "The files," Graham said, his voice raw. "They came from my private archive, the same archive you've had access to for the past month." "Graham, She stopped, trapped between truth and protection, between love and her father's sacrifice. "Did you do this?" Each word fell like ice between them. "It's not what you think." The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "That's not an answer." He moved closer, searching her face. "Did you leak those documents?" Talia closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten. How could she explain that she'd started this journey planning revenge but found love instead? How could she tell him about finding the truth about her father without revealing the very secret Reverend Moore had died protecting? "I can't..." Her voice cracked. "I can't tell you everything." Graham stepped back as if she'd struck him. The pain in his eyes was worse than anger would have been. "I trusted you," he whispered. "After everything, after last night, I thought—" "Please." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "What I feel for you is real." "Is it?" His laugh was bitter. "Was any of it real, Talia? Or was this all part of your plan from the beginning?" The agents knocked and re-entered before she could respond. The room filled with activity again, drawers being opened, files being boxed, computers being tagged as evidence. Through it all, Graham and Talia stood frozen in their own private earthquake. Hours passed in a blur of questions, documentation, and rising media chaos outside the building. By late afternoon, Graham's lawyers had arrived, and preliminary statements were being drafted. Talia watched it all through a haze of misery, knowing each passing minute brought them closer to an inevitable end. As dusk settled over the city, Graham found her in his home office. She was standing by the window, watching news vans cluster at the gate like vultures. "I think it's best if you leave tonight." His voice was flat, stripped of all the warmth she'd grown to love. "The lawyers will handle dissolving our arrangement." Talia turned, seeing the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Graham, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Now he did look at her, and the betrayal in his gaze cut deep. "How you used our marriage to gain access to private files. How you waited until the merger was almost complete to cause maximum damage? Or perhaps you'd like to explain why you pretended to care about me while planning to destroy everything I've built?" "That's not—" She stepped toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't." The word was quiet but final. "Just don't." Talia stood rooted to the spot as he walked away, the soft click of the door closing behind him somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. Upstairs in her room, she packed methodically, each item a reminder of the life she'd briefly touched: the elegant dresses from charity events, the comfortable sweater she'd worn during late-night conversations, the small cross necklace Evelyn had given her just last week. Night fell as she zipped her suitcase, the same one she'd arrived with what felt like a lifetime ago. The house was silent around her, no footsteps in the hall, no quiet knock at her door. Just the weight of unspoken words and irreparable damage. She looked around the room one last time, remembering how foreign it had felt that first night, how much like home it had become. Now it felt like neither, just another space to hold the wreckage of what could have been. Through the window she could see her own reflection imposed over the darkened garden, where just yesterday Graham had told her he loved her. The memory felt like a knife twisting in her heart. She reached out and touched the cool glass, watching her fingerprints mar the perfect surface. In the end, she left the way she came. One suitcase, a guarded heart, and secrets weighing heavy on her soul. Only this time, the secrets weren't weapons to wield, but chains that bound her to silence, keeping her from fighting for the love she'd never meant to find. The morning sun cast long shadows through Talia's old apartment windows, highlighting the empty spaces where furniture once stood. Her footsteps echoed against bare walls as she dragged her suitcase across the worn carpet. The place felt smaller now, stripped of the few possessions she'd managed to store with a friend before moving to Whitlock Manor. She stood in the center of the living room, arms wrapped around herself. The silence pressed in, broken only by a distant siren and the familiar rattle of the building's ancient heating system. Her breath caught as she remembered the luxury she'd grown accustomed to, the warmth of Graham's home that had nothing to do with temperature control. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, voice bouncing off empty walls. There was work to be done. Over the next few hours, Talia unpacked her single suitcase and retrieved her stored belongings. Each item seemed to mock her with memories. The coffee maker Graham had replaced with a better one, the threadbare towels so different from the plush linens at the manor, the simple dishes that felt clumsy after months of fine china. The television hummed in the background as she worked, its noise a poor substitute for human company. She tried to ignore it until a familiar name caught her attention. Graham Whitlock, CEO of Whitlock Industries, faces mounting pressure as federal investigators dig deeper into allegations of corporate fraud. Talia's hands trembled as she watched Graham's face appear on screen. He looked older somehow, though it had been less than 24 hours since she'd left. The media vultures were circling, picking apart his reputation with gleeful efficiency. Sources suggest the leaked documents expose a pattern of unethical business practices dating back to the Moore case 5 years ago. She clicked off the TV, unable to bear more. Her father's name shouldn't be dragged through the mud again, especially not when the truth was so different from what everyone believed. That afternoon, she walked to St. Matthew's Community Church, where she'd occasionally volunteered before everything changed. The familiar red brick building stood solid and reassuring against the grey winter sky. Inside, the smell of soup and fresh bread filled the air. "Talia?" Mrs. Henderson, the kitchen coordinator, looked up from a pot of stew. "My word, we haven't seen you in ages." "I've been—" Talia swallowed hard. "I've been away. I was wondering if you still need help in the kitchen." The older woman's kind eyes studied her face. "Always room for willing hands here, dear. Are you all right?" "I will be." Talia managed a small smile. "I just need to keep busy." Mrs. Henderson didn't press further, just handed her an apron and put her to work chopping vegetables. The routine tasks were soothing. Dice, slice, stir. The kitchen's warmth and the quiet conversation of other volunteers wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Days blurred together. Talia threw herself into the work, arriving early to help with breakfast preparation and staying late to clean up after dinner service. The physical labor left her too tired to think, too exhausted to lie awake remembering Graham's face when he'd asked her to leave. But she couldn't escape the news entirely. Every newspaper stand screamed headlines about Whitlock Industries. Every coffee shop television seemed to feature another expert analyzing Graham's downfall. The stories grew more sensational, painting him as a heartless corporate titan finally exposed for his crimes. "Such a shame," she overheard one volunteer say while sorting donations. "My brother lost his pension when that company went under 5 years ago. Guess karma finally caught up with Whitlock." Talia's hands clenched around the canned goods she was shelving. She wanted to turn around and tell them the truth. How Graham had fought to save those pensions. How her father had chosen silence to protect the greater good. But the words stayed locked behind her teeth, choking her with their weight. Sunday services became her anchor. She slipped into the back pew, drawing strength from familiar hymns and prayers. Sometimes she stayed afterward, kneeling in the empty sanctuary, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was protecting her father's sacrifice worth watching Graham's destruction? Was silence truly better than truth when it caused such harm? "Dear God," she whispered one evening, tears falling onto clasped hands. "Show me what to do." The church office phone rang, startling her from prayer. Through the open door, she heard the secretary answer. "Yes, she's here. One moment, please." Footsteps approached. "Talia, there's a call for you. Someone named Chaplain Reed." Talia's heart skipped. She hadn't heard that name in years, not since her father's funeral. With trembling fingers, she took the phone. "Hello?" "Miss Moore." The chaplain's voice was exactly as she remembered, gentle but carrying authority. "I've been watching the news about Graham Whitlock. Talia glanced around, lowering her voice. "I don't know what to say. Perhaps it's time someone else did the talking," he said carefully. Your father left something in my care. Something about truth taking time. Talia sank into a nearby chair, her father's words from her dream echoing in her mind. What do you mean? I think we need to meet. Chaplain Reed said. There are things you should know, things your father wanted preserved but not buried forever. Can you come to the prison chapel tomorrow morning? Through the stained glass windows, the setting sun painted patterns across the floor, red, blue, purple. Like her father's favorite tie, the one he'd worn the day of his arrest. Like the colors in Graham's garden where he'd first told her he loved her. Yes, she whispered, hope flickering to life in her chest. Yes, I'll be there. The prison chapel stood quiet and unassuming in the morning light. Talia paused at the entrance, her hand resting on the weathered wooden door. The last time she'd been here was for a brief visit with her father, just weeks before his death. Now, years later, the familiar scent of old hymnals and furniture polish brought tears to her eyes. Chaplain Thomas Reed waited inside, his silver hair catching the light from the small, stained glass windows. Though older now, he still carried himself with the same gentle dignity she remembered. He rose from the front pew as she entered, extending both hands in greeting. Miss Moore, he said warmly. Thank you for coming. Talia clasped his hands, noticing how they trembled slightly with age. Thank you for reaching out, Chaplain Reed. I've been lost these past weeks. He gestured for her to sit beside him in the front pew. The wooden bench creaked softly as they settled. Your father was a good man, Talia. One of the finest souls I've ever known in my 37 years of prison ministry. He never lost his faith, Talia said quietly. Even here. I didn't understand how he could stay so peaceful, knowing he was innocent. Chaplain Reed nodded, reaching into his worn leather satchel. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Your father knew that someday the truth would need to come out, but he was adamant about the timing. He withdrew a small digital recorder, holding it carefully. 3 days before he passed, he asked me to record his testimony. He made me promise to keep it safe until it was truly needed. Talia's breath caught. He left a recording. He said, truth takes time to ripen, like fruit on the vine. I didn't fully understand then, but watching recent events unfold, I believe the time he waited for has come. With reverent care, the chaplain pressed play. Static crackled briefly, then Talia heard her father's voice, weaker than she remembered, but still rich with conviction. My name is Reverend Samuel Moore, and I need to set the record straight about Graham Whitlock and Whitlock Industries. Talia pressed her hands to her mouth as her father's story unfolded. He detailed everything, the corruption he'd discovered, Graham's desperate attempts to stop it, and the impossible choice they'd faced. His voice grew stronger as he explained his decision to take the blame. Graham wanted to fight it, to expose everything, but that would have meant hundreds of families losing their homes, their savings, their children's college funds. The guilty parties had buried the evidence so deep, proving anything in court would have taken years. Years those families didn't have. Tears rolled down Talia's cheeks as she listened to her father describe the night he'd met with Graham, how they'd prayed together for guidance. I saw such anguish in that young man's eyes. He was willing to sacrifice everything to do what was right. But sometimes doing right isn't about fighting. Sometimes it's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. I chose to confess to spare those families. Graham fought me on it, said he couldn't let me take the fall, but I reminded him that my life was already lived. His work, his ability to quietly right those wrongs from within, that was worth more than my freedom. The recording continued, her father's voice growing tired but remaining resolute. I tell this story now not to clear my name, but to prevent future harm. When the time comes that this truth can heal rather than hurt, I pray it brings understanding. And to my daughter Talia, if you hear this someday, know that every choice I made was guided by love. Love for God, love for those in need, and love for you." Static filled the chapel as the recording ended. Talia sat motionless, tears flowing freely now. The morning light through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across her hands, reminding her of another morning, another prayer for guidance. Chaplain Reed placed the recorder gently in her lap. "Your father trusted that God would reveal the truth at the right moment. I believe that moment is now." Talia ran her fingers over the small device, feeling the weight of her father's sacrifice, of Graham's pain, of years of misunderstanding. People are destroying Graham's reputation, everything he's worked for, just like they did to my father. "Yes," the chaplain said softly. "And just as your father protected others through his silence, perhaps you can protect through speaking truth." Standing slowly, Talia walked to the chapel's simple wooden cross. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a warm embrace, like her father's arms around her. She thought of Graham, his quiet strength, his hidden battles, his love that she'd almost thrown away. That evening, alone in her apartment, Talia knelt beside her bed just as she had as a child. The recorder sat on her nightstand, her father's voice still echoing in her mind. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the truth that could change so many stories. "Father God," she whispered, "give me courage. Show me how to honor both my fathers, the one who raised me and the one who taught me to love. Again, help me use this truth to heal, not harm." Rising from her knees, Talia picked up the recorder. Her hand no longer trembled. She knew what she had to do. The truth had ripened, like fruit on the vine, and it was time for harvest, whatever the cost might be. Dawn broke over the city as Talia's hands shook, sealing the padded envelope containing her father's recorded testimony. She'd stayed up all night, carefully making copies and writing detailed cover letters for each recipient, major news outlets, federal investigators, and the district attorney's office. Each package told the story of a father's sacrifice and a good man's silence. The morning air felt crisp as she walked to the post office, her heart pounding with each step. The elderly clerk smiled as she handed over the stack of priority mail envelopes. "Important business today, dear." "More than you know," Talia whispered, watching as the packages disappeared into the sorting bin. She said a silent prayer, remembering her father's words. Truth takes time. By mid-afternoon, the story exploded across every news channel. Talia sat curled in her apartment's lone armchair, watching as analysts and legal experts dissected the revelation. Her father's voice, strong and clear, played in clips across the networks. "Breaking news. New evidence exonerates Graham Whitlock in the decade-old corruption case at Whitlock Industries," one reporter announced. "A recording has surfaced from the late Reverend Samuel Moore, explaining his voluntary confession that saved hundreds of jobs." Footage showed federal investigators leaving Whitlock Industries, their expressions serious, but notably different from days before. The camera caught a senior agent's brief statement. "We are thoroughly reviewing this new evidence. Initial analysis confirms its authenticity." As evening approached, Graham's office announced an emergency press conference. Talia's hands clutched her worn Bible as the cameras showed him approaching the podium. He looked tired but composed, his usual reserved manner touched with something deeper, a mix of grief and gratitude that made her heart ache. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos of camera flashes. "Today, truth has finally come to light about events that changed many lives 10 years ago. I stand before you not to defend myself, but to honor a man whose sacrifice protected hundreds of families." Graham's composure wavered slightly as he continued. Reverend Samuel Moore was more than a minister. He was a man who lived his faith through action, who chose to bear others' burdens at great personal cost. When faced with an impossible choice between exposing corruption immediately, which would have bankrupted innocent employees, or allowing time for quiet resolution, he chose the path of greatest sacrifice. The cameras caught tears in his eyes, though his voice remained strong. He went to prison knowing the truth, carrying that burden so others wouldn't have to. I wanted to fight it then. I offered to resign, to face the consequences myself, but Reverend Moore said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in fighting, but in protecting those who can't protect themselves. Talia wiped her own tears as Graham detailed the years following her father's conviction, how he'd worked tirelessly to strengthen corporate oversight, establish employee protection programs, and create scholarship funds for workers' children, all while honoring his promise to maintain silence until the truth could do more good than harm. I stand here today not seeking vindication, but asking that we honor Reverend Moore's memory. His sacrifice protected not just jobs, but homes, families, futures. He demonstrated that true leadership sometimes means bearing the weight of others' mistakes, carrying burdens in silence until the right time comes. Graham paused, looking directly into the cameras. To Reverend Moore's family, I can never fully express my gratitude. Your father's courage changed my understanding of faith, sacrifice, and love. His example guides every decision I make. Talia sobbed openly now, her father's Bible pressed to her heart. On screen, Graham concluded by announcing the establishment of the Samuel Moore Ethics in Leadership Foundation, dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and protecting vulnerable employees. As reporters shouted questions, Talia noticed something different in Graham's eyes, a peace she'd never seen before, as if a heavy burden had finally lifted. She remembered their shared meals, quiet conversations, the growing love she'd almost destroyed through mistrust. The news channels switched to analysis, experts praising both Reverend Moore's sacrifice and Graham's decade-long work to reform corporate culture from within. Public opinion shifted dramatically as people understood the full story. Social media filled with messages of support, many from former Whitlock Industries employees sharing stories of how their jobs had saved their families. Talia turned off the television, moving to her window to watch the sunset paint the city sky in shades of pink and gold. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Truth takes time to ripen. She understood now, not just his words, but the deep love that had motivated both him and Graham to carry such heavy burdens for so long. The apartment felt too quiet as darkness fell. She lit a small candle, remembering countless evenings watching her father prepare sermons by candlelight when they couldn't afford electricity. "You were right, Daddy," she whispered. "About everything. About him." She was still lost in prayer when a knock echoed through her apartment. The sound was soft but clear in the evening silence, carrying all the weight of endings and new beginnings. Talia's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Through the peephole, she saw Graham standing in the dim hallway light, his usual composed demeanor, replaced by something more vulnerable. He wore no tie, his collar unbuttoned, looking nothing like the polished CEO from the press conference hours earlier. She opened the door slowly, her heart pounding. Graham stood with his hands in his pockets, uncertainty written across his features. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I should have trusted you," they both said simultaneously, then shared a small, sad smile at the coincidence. "May I come in?" Graham asked softly. Talia nodded, stepping back to let him enter her modest apartment. The contrast between this space and Whitlock Manor couldn't have been starker. A single room with mismatched furniture and walls that needed paint. But Graham's eyes held no judgment, only a deep weariness and hope. I'm sorry, he began, remaining standing as Talia sat on her worn sofa. I should have seen that you were carrying your own burden. When I thought you had betrayed me. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I let fear overcome faith. Again. Talia clasped her hands in her lap, fighting tears. I came to you planning to expose everything, to get revenge for my father. I was so certain you were the villain in his story. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I was wrong, Graham. So wrong. He moved closer, sitting carefully beside her. Your father was the finest man I've ever known. When I saw your name on the contract applications, He swallowed hard. Part of me hoped you might be the second chance I didn't deserve. Why didn't you tell me the truth right away? Talia asked, though she already knew the answer. Graham's voice was gentle. The same reason you couldn't tell me yours. Sometimes protecting others means carrying their secrets, even when the weight feels unbearable. Talia nodded, remembering countless nights her father had knelt in prayer, bearing burdens she hadn't understood until now. He never lost faith in God's timing. She whispered. Even in prison, he said everything would be clear when it needed to be. Your father taught me about real faith. Graham admitted. Not the kind that shows up in Sunday best, but the kind that walks through fire believing good will come of it. He turned to face her fully. Talia, I didn't come here about the contract. Her heart skipped a beat. No? No. He took a deep breath. These past months, watching you care for others at events, seeing your strength and compassion, I fell in love with you. Not the role you were playing, but you. His voice grew softer. When I thought you had betrayed that trust, it broke something in me. But even then, I couldn't stop loving you. Tears spilled down Talia's cheeks. I tried so hard not to love you, to remember why I came. But then I saw how you treated people, the janitor, the scholarship students, everyone. I saw my father's kind of faith lived out in your actions, not just words. Graham reached out slowly, taking her hand. I don't want you to come back to fulfill a contract. That chapter is closed. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. If you choose to be part of my life, I want it to be freely given. No conditions, no pretense. I'm still healing. Talia admitted. Learning to trust again, to let go of old anger. Then we'll heal together, Graham said simply. Day by day, in God's timing. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for everything at once, just permission to walk this path with you, however long it takes. Talia looked at their joined hands, remembering her father's words about truth and time. I'd like that, she said softly. To start again, slowly. Graham's smile held all the warmth of dawn breaking. Slowly, he agreed, with truth between us this time. They sat together in comfortable silence as night settled over the city, their clasped hands a bridge between past and future, hurt and healing, fear and faith. Through her window, stars began to appear, small lights in the darkness, like hope taking shape one point at a time. Autumn painted the city in rich golds and deep reds as leaves drifted past the law school's Gothic windows. Talia sat in the lecture hall, her notebook open, absorbing every word of her professor's discussion on corporate ethics. 6 months had passed since that night in her apartment, and each day had brought small steps toward healing and new beginnings. The Reverend James Moore Foundation for Ethics and Education, established by Graham earlier that year, had made it possible for her to return to law school. But it wasn't just about her. The foundation provided scholarships to dozens of students from underprivileged backgrounds, focusing especially on children of incarcerated parents. Her father's legacy lived on in ways she never could have imagined. After class, Talia gathered her books and walked through the campus courtyard. The crisp October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee from nearby cafes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Graham. "Dinner tonight. There's something I'd like to discuss." She smiled, typing back a quick yes. Their relationship had grown slowly, deliberately, built on a foundation of honest conversations and shared faith. Every Sunday they sat together in the small church where her father had once preached, their fingers intertwined during prayers. The congregation had welcomed Graham without judgment, seeing not the wealthy businessman, but the man seeking to make amends and live authentically. That evening, Talia arrived home to find Graham waiting outside her apartment building. He looked different from the corporate titan she'd first met, more relaxed in casual clothes, his face younger without the weight of pretense. His decision to step down from active corporate leadership had surprised the business world, but not her. She understood his need to realign his life with his values. "How was class?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "Fascinating. We discussed ethical decision-making in crisis situations." She squeezed his hand. "The professor used your case as an example, how sometimes doing the right thing means facing public misunderstanding." Graham's eyes softened. "Your father taught me that. I'm just sorry it took me so long to fully embrace it." He opened the car door for her. "I thought we might take a walk before dinner. There's somewhere special I'd like to show you." They drove to a community center in one of the city's struggling neighborhoods. Construction equipment surrounded the building, and fresh paint brightened its walls. "This is one of the foundation's new projects," Graham explained as they walked the grounds. "We're creating a support center for families affected by incarceration. Legal aid, counseling, job training." Talia's throat tightened with emotion. "Dad would have loved this. He inspired it." Graham said quietly, "Every person who walks through these doors will know his story, how one man's integrity changed countless lives." They walked through the center's garden, where volunteers had planted late-blooming flowers that glowed in the setting sun. Graham seemed nervous, his hand fidgeting in his pocket. "Talia," he said finally, stopping beside a small fountain. "These past months have taught me what real love looks like. Not the carefully staged kind we once pretended for cameras, but something true and patient and healing." Her heart began to race as he turned to face her fully. "When I first met you, I was hiding behind wealth and position, trying to control everything. You helped me find my way back to authentic faith, not through words, but by showing me what it means to seek truth no matter the cost." Graham took both her hands in his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking you this as a CEO or a billionaire. Those titles mean nothing compared to the man I want to be, the man your father helped me glimpse, and you helped me become." Slowly he knelt on one knee, and Talia's eyes filled with tears. "Talia Moore, will you marry me? Not for show or status, but as my partner in everything, in faith, in service, in building something meaningful with our lives." The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and a gentle breeze stirred the garden flowers. Talia thought of her father's last recorded words about God's perfect timing, about truth that takes patience to reveal itself. "Yes," she whispered, then louder with joy, "Yes." Graham slipped a simple but elegant ring on her finger, not a flashy statement of wealth, but a token of genuine love. As he stood and wrapped her in his arms, Talia felt her father's presence in the peace that filled her heart. They held each other as darkness fell and stars appeared above the garden. Their embrace was a testimony to love's power to heal, to redemption's patient work, and to the God who could take broken pieces and create something beautiful. "I love you," Graham murmured against her hair. "I love you too," Talia replied, her father's favorite scripture echoing in her mind. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. In that moment, surrounded by the garden her father's legacy had helped create, held by the man whose life had been transformed by that same legacy, Talia knew with absolute certainty that love, patient, honest, healing love, was the greatest truth of all. 3 months after their engagement, on a bright Saturday afternoon in early autumn, the old stone church glowed with natural light. Simple white flowers and greenery adorned the wooden pews, and soft music filled the intimate space. Unlike the cold civil ceremony that had started their journey, this sanctuary held warmth and truth. Near the altar, 2 framed photographs of Reverend Samuel Moore rested on brass stands. In one, he stood proudly in his clerical robes, his kind eyes and gentle smile captured forever. The other showed him with a young Talia, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Fresh flowers surrounded the frames, a tribute to his enduring influence. In the bride's room, Evelyn Whitlock helped Talia with her dress, a simple, elegant gown that reflected the day's authenticity. "Your father would be so proud," Evelyn said softly, adjusting the veil. "Not just of how beautiful you look, but of the woman you've become." Talia squeezed Evelyn's hand, grateful for this mother figure who had helped heal so many wounds. "Thank you for showing me what forgiveness looks like in action," she whispered. "For helping me see Graham's heart when I was too angry to look." Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "God's timing is perfect, dear. Sometimes we have to walk through darkness to truly appreciate the light." In the small church office, Graham stood before a mirror, straightening his tie. Gone was the corporate armor he'd once hidden behind. Today he wore a classic black suit that spoke of humility rather than power. His hands trembled slightly as he pinned on the boutonniere. The old church organist began playing softly, signaling it was time. The small gathering of guests, true friends and family rather than business associates, stood as the wooden doors opened. Talia appeared in the doorway, and Graham's breath caught. She carried a bouquet of white roses mixed with wildflowers, a reminder of the garden where he'd proposed. But it was her radiant smile that transformed her, the smile of someone who had found peace with her past and joy in her future. As she walked down the aisle, their eyes met and held. Both remembered that first awkward meeting in his office, the walls they'd built, the painful journey toward truth. Graham felt tears threatening as he watched her approach, overwhelmed by God's grace in bringing beauty from ashes. The minister welcomed everyone warmly, speaking of love's power to heal and transform. He acknowledged Reverend Moore's presence in spirit, reading from his favorite passage about faith, hope, and love. When it came time for their vows, Talia and Graham had chosen to write their own, words that reflected their unique path to this moment. Graham spoke first, his voice steady with conviction. "Talia, I promise to love you with complete honesty and openness, to honor your father's legacy by living with integrity, to partner with you in serving others and seeking truth, to cherish the faith that brought us together and guides our path forward." Talia's voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. "Graham, I promise to love you with forgiveness and grace, to trust in God's perfect timing, to stand beside you in both challenges and joys, to build a future founded on truth, strengthened by faith, and dedicated to making a difference in others' lives." As they exchanged rings, Evelyn wiped away tears, remembering her own answered prayers for Graham to find genuine love. The simple gold bands represented not wealth or status, but an unbreakable commitment to honor and truth. The minister's words echoed through the sunlit sanctuary. "What God has joined together, let no one separate." Their first kiss as husband and wife was tender and real, No cameras, no pretense, no hidden agendas. Just two people who had learned that love's greatest power lies in its ability to heal and restore. After the ceremony, they paused before Reverend Moore's photographs. Talia touched her father's image gently. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, "for showing us both what really matters." The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor as Talia and Graham walked hand in hand toward the doors. Their steps were unhurried, peaceful, no longer driven by revenge or fear, but moving forward in grace. As they reached the doorway, they paused for a moment, squeezing each other's hands. The path ahead was bright with possibility, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they had learned its deepest lessons. Their love story had begun in deception, but found its truth in forgiveness. Their future would be built on that foundation. One day, one choice, one act of grace at a time. The church bells rang joyfully as they stepped into the sunshine, ready to begin their new chapter together. Their fingers remained intertwined, a simple gesture that spoke of unity, strength, and enduring love. The gathered friends and family watched them go, witnesses to love's power to redeem even the most broken beginnings. In that moment, as they walked away from the church together, both Talia and Graham knew with certainty that their greatest adventure was just beginning, not as a CEO and his contract bride, but as two people committed to living out the truth they had discovered. That love, when rooted in faith and grace, has the power to heal all wounds and light the darkest paths. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Talia and Graham made their way through the quiet prison cemetery. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the simple stone markers. In Talia's arms, she carried a bouquet of fresh flowers, her father's favorites, white lilies mixed with purple irises. Graham held a wooden frame containing the newspaper article that announced the Reverend Samuel Moore Foundation. The headline read, "Justice Restored. New Foundation Honors Pastor's Legacy." Below it detailed the foundation's mission, providing scholarships to underprivileged youth, supporting prison ministry programs, and funding legal assistance for those wrongly accused. They found Reverend Moore's grave easily, a modest headstone that bore his name, dates, and the simple inscription, "Faithful Servant." Talia knelt down, carefully arranging the flowers while Graham stood quietly beside her, giving her space for this moment. "Hi, Daddy," Talia said softly, her voice steady and clear in the morning stillness. "I've wanted to come talk to you for so long, but I couldn't until the anger was gone." She touched the cool stone gently. "I understand now, all of it. Why you chose silence over vindication. Why you carried that burden alone." Tears gathered in her eyes, but they weren't bitter anymore. "You knew that sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of being right. That real strength isn't about fighting back. It's about protecting others, even when it costs you everything." She smiled through her tears. "I finally understand the kind of strength you carried." Graham knelt beside her, placing the framed article against the headstone. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "Reverend Moore, I never got to thank you properly. Your sacrifice changed everything, not just for the company or the employees you protected, but for me personally." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I used to measure success by profit margins and stock prices, but you showed me what real courage looks like. It's not found in boardroom victories or business deals. It's in choosing what's right, even when it's hardest." Talia reached for Graham's hand, squeezing it gently as he continued. "Your example reshaped my entire understanding of leadership and responsibility. The foundation bearing your name is just the beginning of honoring that legacy." They sat quietly together for a moment, watching as early morning sunlight began to warm the stone. Talia traced her father's name with her finger. "We're making sure your sacrifice wasn't wasted, Daddy. Every scholarship student, every person receiving legal aid, every life touched through prison ministry, they're all part of your story now." In the distance, church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying across the peaceful cemetery. Graham helped Talia to her feet, and they stood together looking at the grave one last time. The morning light caught the glass of the framed article, reflecting like a promise of hope. Hand in hand, they walked back along the dewy path, their footsteps synchronized in the quiet morning. The church bells continued their gentle song, ringing out across time, not just marking another hour, but celebrating a legacy of truth passed forward, faith restored, and a future redeemed for generations to come. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.